All right, now let's take a quick look at kind of the history of economic growth in the United States. And you can see, here we've got some nice growth right here, right? This would be the growth rate, the average annual. And so, Industrial Revolution taking off, then we have this one, and then we have this dip here, right? And then we came back up, and then we have this dip right here. So, this right here would probably be the internet coming along. We see a big shift in the way we do things. But, we want to look at these dips here to figure out why we went down. Now, it's possible that this is kind of more like our long run average. And so we saw a big boost here, and now we're just kind of settling down. It's that diminishing returns, and we're kind of settling into the flat part of that curve. And that this was an anomaly right here due to the internet. It could be that we're always going to kind of go up and down like this, or it could be that we should be up here and we want to look at these dips here to figure out what caused them. And if we can figure out what caused them, then maybe we can eliminate that in the long run. But so what we're looking at is, like I said, is this the normal, and we're going to see slower growth from now on, and what caused these slowdowns? So the optimistic view is that it's not really that we're less productive, it's just become more difficult to measure when we switched. So if we go here, this was when we started to kind of shift away from manufacturing and into service. And so a lot of people think that's just harder to measure, and that we're not really less productive. It just took us a while to kind of catch up on how to measure those things. When you're doing mostly manufacturing, it's easy to measure. You can see exactly how many units were produced. But when we go to more service business, it really required a shift in how we measure things. That's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view is that really this is the new normal, and so this is our slow, steady decline, and that this peak right here was really just kind of an anomaly. And so in that one, like I said, we started a long run decline. We had that brief initial effects of IT and the internet and all that kind of stuff, and that they say we're going to stay low, okay? And so that the average standard of living is going to increase very, very slowly over time. Now, obviously, we don't know yet which one of those is right, and it'll take us a while to see, but we can look at the slowdowns and try and figure out what caused them in order to help us predict it. So why do we have that? A lot of them, again, were measurement issues. When we moved from production and manufacturing, manufacturing to service, and so it was harder to track this stuff. IT, it drives a lot of what we do, and when we were manufacturing, you saw big purchases of machinery and equipment and that kind of stuff. And when the main thing driving you is IT, the expenditures aren't as big, so that kind of slows down the economy. We're no longer purchasing huge amounts of equipment, which are big, so the investment component is smaller for that. We also see slowing population growth, and so even if you have more capital, you have less workers, less capital requirements, so that's again kind of related to the IT, and also the fact that there's more service. And so that industry of creating and selling the capital was a big part of the economy as well, and so that's kind of slowing down. So even if consumers are buying as much, the businesses aren't. That business-to-business part kind of goes down, which again relates to the price of capital is falling. And remember, we measure GDP by the market price. So if the market price of capital continues to go down, even if we're producing the same amount of capital, that kind of drags GDP down. So those are some explanations for the slowdown, and I'll leave it up to you whether you want to take the optimistic or the pessimistic view. Now, so that's a little summary of the U.S. Let's look at why the whole world isn't rich. So if we know what's necessary for economic growth, why can't we just make that happen everywhere? So we know that we need to increase the quantity of capital per hour worked, and we need to use the best technology. So more capital, better capital. Seems really easy, right? And so anybody should be able to do this, right? So the economic growth model that we see predicts that poor countries will grow faster than rich countries because they're still at that bottom part of that production function, and so you can still see big increases in output with really small increases in capital. They're still at that part of the curve, and also because they have so little technology, it's really easy to add it, and they don't have to develop it. It's already been developed by other countries. So the example I like to give is if somebody is trekking their way through the jungle and they have to clear a path. So picture somebody going through there with a machete and it's all overgrown and they have to cut every little thing out to clear a path. They're going to move very slowly. But somebody who comes along behind them, the path is already cleared and they can move much faster. And so that's why you see the developing countries or the industrialized countries are going to have slower growth rates. They're the ones that are clearing the path. And so they're slogging their way through there. But other countries come along and the technology has already been developed so they can grow at a much faster rate, at least at the beginning until they kind of catch up. So that's the catch-up theory, which says that the GDP per capita in poor countries will grow faster than rich countries. So on a graph, it would look like this. Here's the growth rate. And so you would see high growth rates when you have low capital, all right? This is the initial level of capital. So this would be 0. And so you would see these really high growth rates when you have very little capital. And then when you have a lot of capital, you see smaller growth rates, okay? So that's the catch-up line. And so let's look and see if this works. So if we examine high-income countries, we do see this. They're mostly clustered along this line. And so you have a couple outliers, but for the most part, the countries with lower capital have higher growth rates. And then the higher the growth rates, the higher the capital, the lower the growth rates. So that sort of makes sense. Let's put on some more countries. Now it doesn't work, right? Because if it worked, everybody would be clustered around this line, which they are definitely not. So what's going on with these guys? These guys have no capital, and some of them have negative growth rates or really, really low growth rates. They should be able to recognize. They should be able to add some capital, add some technology, and see big, high growth rates. So why aren't they? So that's what we want to look at. We're like, okay, so why is Honduras not doing it, but Botswana is? And so we want to look at some of these guys and see what's going on there. And this is 1960, but still, I was going to say China's obviously going to be not quite there right now. But so we want to look at some of these countries that have been able to achieve economic growth and some of these countries that haven't, and say what's going on here. So when we look at the countries who should be growing that aren't, when we look at some of these guys over here, what's going on with these guys? And so we see a couple different things in common. One is the failure to enforce the rule of law, and I'm going to kind of talk about each one of these separately. Wars and revolutions, poor public health and education, and low rates of savings and investment. And when you look at it, these all point back to the things that we've already been talking about. So rule of law. So it's not enough just to have the rules, you have to enforce them. So so we talked about property rights and guaranteeing rights for entrepreneurs. So if the rules aren't there to protect these risk takers, or if the rules are there but they're never enforced, then you're not going to see anybody willing to take a risk here. So we have to have an independent court system in place that enforces contracts as well. So for instance, if I'm a business and I'm thinking about expanding into some country and I'm going to build a $40 million plant, if I think that anybody can come along and take that over and I have no recourse, I'm not going to be willing to risk that investment there, right? I have to know that my property is protected. I have to know that if somebody enters into a contract with me that they have to fulfill their part of the bargain, because if they don't, then I'm not willing to take that risk. So having laws in place that encourage entrepreneurs, that protect property rights, that enforce contracts, having the laws there and then enforcing those laws is critical. And when that's missing, then we don't see that that path to economic growth that we need. People aren't willing to take those risks. The other reasons for lack of growth, wars and revolutions. Again, if people are, and when we talk about wars and revolutions, again, part of it is the instability. I'm not going to build a plant here and hire a bunch of people if I think that this government is going to be overthrown any day, and I could lose everything, right? So the current government might be friendly to me, but I can't guarantee. If it changes every 6 months, I'm not going to take a risk there. There's too many other places where I can go, and also, when a country's at war, and we're looking at some of these countries have been at war for many, many, many years. 100 years. Or maybe I'm exaggerating, but it's a lot. Then if those people are just constantly fighting, you're destroying your resources, so it's not a productive use of any of your resources, labor or capital. And so again, nobody's going to build a manufacturing plant nobody's going to invest in technology in a war-torn area if that's just going to be, destroyed by somebody else. So that's counterproductive. Poor education and health. And again, we talked about the human capital and the knowledge capital. People can't work if they're sick, so they're not productive if they're sick. And if they don't have an education, we don't see the human capital. We don't see the experience and technology. There's no point bringing technology in if the people can't use it. And then a low rate of savings and investment. If we don't have savings, we don't have investment, which means we don't have technology and capital, right? Those things were necessary. The investment was necessary for labor and for technology and capital. If people can not feed their families, they can't save, right? And so if they're very, very poor, there's nothing left over to save, and so it's a vicious cycle, and it's very hard to break. So one of the ways to break that low cycle, so it's easy to say, well, you need to invest in technology, but if you can't even pay the bills today, you can't set aside for those purchases. Remember, those are big purchases. So the way to break that cycle of low savings and investment is foreign investment. So the people within this country might not have any money left over, but people outside the country do. And so you need to attract those foreign investments to break that cycle. So foreign direct investment is when people purchase or build a building or actual physical capital. Foreign portfolio investment is when they buy the stocks and bonds of another country. Either one's going to help. So either, somebody comes in and builds a plant here or purchases it, or they buy stock in this company. Either way. So if you can't break that low savings and investment cycle, you need to attract foreign investors, either direct or portfolio investment. And again, you need to create you need policies in place that will encourage that kind of investment. So when we see this, people people from one country investing in another, that's globalization. And so we saw people kind of cut themselves off, and they go more isolationism. We're not going to trade with other countries. We're not going to invest in other countries. We don't want other countries investing in us. And so they thought that would protect them, but it actually ended up hurting them. You can almost always watch it. The isolationism theory will always reduce your growth. So by the 80s, a lot of countries kind of realized that and started to reverse that. And you saw a trend toward globalization, countries becoming more open to foreign trade and foreign investment. And you can see since that time, the countries that embraced globalization experienced much higher rates of growth than the countries that didn't. And the countries that didn't, a lot of them are still right where they were back here after World War II. And so you need to encourage, to me, for a poor country, that's the best thing they can do is create an environment that encourages globalization, foreign trade, and foreign investment. That's the only way for them to get out of that cycle. So growth policy. So we can say some of the policies that are essential to creating this economic growth. We need to enhance property rights and the rule of law. We need to improve health and education, policies that promote technological change, and policies that promote savings investment. This is not just for poor countries, all right? This is any country and anything. So when we get to the section on fiscal policy, anything aimed at one of these is aimed at long-term growth, okay? So any policy, whether it be a poor country or a developed country, anything that focuses on these is going to be focused on long-run growth. Anything that hinders these is going to be a deterrent to long-run growth. And so that's really important to know. And sometimes, like I said, you have to choose between the short term and the long term. Like this might make things good now, but it's going to hurt our long-term growth. So those are things to consider. Now, the last one I just wanted to talk about is economic growth, good or bad. We're assuming that economic growth is good. It's beneficial for the citizens. It improves the standard of living. Some people will disagree with that. There are negative effects to the environment. I mean, and we've seen that China was able to achieve really high economic growth, but it came at a cost to the environment, depleting natural resources. And the other one is diminishment of distinctive cultures. This is a tough one, and this is why some people will protest about like the World Trade Organization and that kind of stuff, because they're like, you're harming these cultures, these distinctive cultures. And that's a tough one, because like if you look at their culture, if you look at Haiti, for example, Haiti has been poor for a really, really long time. And there's so many people living in poverty. So is it fair to say, well, we want to leave their culture alone, or is the right thing to do to say we need to help these people get out of this poverty? So it's a difficult question to answer. Again, with economics, we'll say, okay, this is, if we do this, here's what will happen. If we do this, here's what's going to happen to the growth rate or GDP and that kind of stuff. But there are other issues to consider. Whether so it's not black and white. We stick to a positive analysis, but there are a lot of normative and arguments there to say this is not worth the cost. But like I said, when you look at these very poor countries, most of the developing nations, we've been there, right? We've been through that. We know what causes it, and we want to help them be less poor. We want to help the people there be better off. Is that more important than preserving a distinctive culture? I don't know. Some people are fine with everybody's cultures blending together. Japanese people love American stuff, Americans love Japanese stuff, and everybody's like, that's cool. Everybody, we're all blending together into one culture. Some people are not okay with that. So that's not something we can answer in this class, but it is something to think about. But most of the time we assume that economic growth is good because it makes people better off.